You woke up to the smell. That's what you remembered most later before everything else faded. The smell of rotting potatoes filling the air so thick you could taste it. Your father was standing in the field, his hands covered in black slime, pulling up plant after plant. Every single one was destroyed. The potatoes that should have fed your family for the entire year had turned to putrid mush overnight. Your father didn't speak. He just stood there staring at his ruined crop, and you saw something break in his face. You were 8 years old in Ireland in 1845, and you just watched your family's entire food supply die in the ground. Your mother came out of the cottage, saw what your father was holding, and made a sound you never heard before. Not quite a scream. Not quite a sob, just a noise of pure despair. You had 5 siblings. Your family survived on potatoes. Potatoes for breakfast, potatoes for dinner, potatoes every single day because that's all you could afford, and all your small plot of land could produce enough of to keep 7 children alive. And now they were gone. All of them. Rotted. Worthless. Your father dropped to his knees in the black mud, and you understood with the clarity that only children have, that everything was about to get much, much worse. You just didn't know yet that worse meant watching your siblings die one by one. That worse meant eating grass and nettles, and anything you could find just to fill the screaming emptiness in your stomach. That worse meant becoming so weak you couldn't cry anymore when your baby sister stopped breathing. This was the Great Famine, and you were about to learn what it really meant to starve. The Great Irish Famine from 1845 to 1852 saw approximately 1 million people die from starvation and disease, with another million emigrating in desperate attempts to survive. The famine was caused by potato blight, a disease that destroyed the potato crops that the Irish poor depended on almost exclusively for survival. But the famine wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a political catastrophe. Ireland was producing plenty of other food during the famine years: grain, meat, dairy products. But those were cash crops owned by landlords, and they were exported to England while the Irish starved. Armed guards protected food shipments leaving Ireland while people died in the ditches beside the roads. The British government's response was inadequate and often cruel, based on the belief that the famine was God's judgment on the Irish, or that providing aid would create dependency. Relief efforts were deliberately limited. Workhouses were established but made intentionally horrible to deter people from seeking help. Public works programs paid starvation wages for backbreaking labor. And through it all, food kept leaving Ireland. Ships full of grain sailing past villages where children were dying from hunger. The famine killed through starvation, but also through the diseases that preyed on weakened, malnourished bodies: typhus, dysentery, cholera. Entire families were wiped out, entire villages disappeared, and the world watched it happen. Bridget Donnelly was 8 when the blight destroyed her family's potato crop. She lived with her parents and 5 siblings in a small cottage in County Mayo. Her father rented a tiny plot of land from an English landlord. The rent consumed most of what little money they had. The family survived on potatoes they grew themselves. When the potatoes failed, there was nothing to replace them. No savings, no other food source, just sudden, complete loss of their only sustenance. The first weeks weren't the worst. They still had a little oatmeal. Some turnips they'd stored. They rationed it carefully, making it stretch as long as possible. But it ran out quickly, feeding 7 children and 2 adults. Then came the hunger. Real hunger, not missing a meal, not feeling peckish. The kind of hunger that consumes every thought, that makes your stomach cramp and twist, that leaves you weak and dizzy and desperate. Bridget's mother tried everything. She went to neighbors begging for food, but everyone was in the same situation. She tried to buy food in town, but prices had skyrocketed because everyone was desperate. A loaf of bread cost more than a week's wages. The family started eating things that weren't food: grass, nettles, tree bark, anything to fill their stomachs. It didn't help. Your body can't survive on grass. Just gave them diarrhea, which made the malnutrition worse. Within 2 months, Bridget's youngest sibling, a baby barely a year old, died, not from hunger directly, from one of the diseases that thrived when people were starving. The baby's immune system couldn't fight off a simple infection. She developed a fever, grew weaker, and died in 3 days. There was no doctor, no medicine. Just a mother holding her dying child and knowing there was nothing she could do. They buried the baby behind the cottage. No coffin, just wrapped in cloth and placed in the ground. There was no priest. The local priest was overwhelmed with funerals, conducting dozens every day. Bridget's father dug the small grave while the family stood around it. No one cried. They were too weak, too shocked. They just stood there, then went back inside to continue the slow process of starving. The baby's death was the first, not the last. 2 months later, Bridget's 6-year-old brother died. He'd been healthy before the famine, strong, full of energy. The hunger had reduced him to a skeleton. His arms were like sticks. His stomach was distended from fluid accumulation, a symptom of severe malnutrition. He stopped being able to walk, just lay on the dirt floor of the cottage, too weak to move. He died quietly, just stopped breathing while Bridget sat next to him. They buried him next to the baby. The hunger was constant and all-consuming. Bridget thought about food every waking moment, dreamed about potatoes at night. Her body was eating itself, consuming muscle and fat to stay alive. She grew thin, so thin her bones showed through her skin. Her hair started falling out, her gums bled. These were symptoms of scurvy and other deficiency diseases caused by malnutrition. Her stomach hurt constantly, a deep gnawing pain that never stopped. She was so weak she could barely walk. Simple tasks like carrying water became impossible. The entire family was deteriorating. Bridget's father looked like a ghost. His eyes were sunken. His skin was gray. He stopped working because he was too weak. Not that there was work to be found. The landlord had no use for tenants who couldn't pay rent. Evictions were happening across Ireland. Families turned out of their cottages to die in the roads. Bridget's family was behind on rent. They knew eviction was coming. They just didn't know when. If you were Bridget, 8 years old, and watching your siblings die one after another, your own body slowly shutting down from starvation, no hope of food or help coming, how would you have kept going each day? What would you have thought about when your stomach hurt so badly you couldn't sleep? The diseases that accompanied starvation were as deadly as the hunger itself. When you're severely malnourished, your immune system collapses. Every infection becomes life-threatening. Typhus spread rapidly through starving populations. Carried by lice, thrived in the unsanitary, overcrowded conditions where multiple families were forced to share space. Bridget's family got typhus in their 8th month of famine. It started with Bridget's mother, high fever, severe headache, then a rash. Within days, she was delirious. The fever burned through her weakened body. She lasted a week, died in the cottage while her children watched. Then Bridget's father got it. He was even weaker than her mother had been. He died in 4 days, just burned up from the inside. Bridget and her 3 remaining siblings were orphaned. 4 children, the oldest being Bridget at 8, alone in a cottage with 2 dead parents lying on the floor. They didn't have the strength to bury them. They just lived with the bodies for days until a neighbor finally came and helped drag them outside. The bodies were put in a mass grave. By this point, individual burials had become impossible. Too many dead. Too few living with the strength to dig graves. But here's what makes the Great Famine even more unconscionable. It was preventable. Food was available. Ireland was still producing and exporting massive quantities of food throughout the famine years. Enough food to feed the entire Irish population several times over. But that food belonged to landlords who sold it for profit. The British government could have stopped the exports, could have redirected the food to feed starving Irish people. They chose not to. Some officials argued that interfering with the market would set a bad precedent. Others believed the Irish were lazy and that the famine would teach them a lesson. The Prime Minister, Lord Russell, believed in laissez-faire economics so strongly that he refused to provide adequate relief even as reports of mass death reached him. The few relief efforts that were implemented were deliberately inadequate. Soup kitchens that provided starvation rations, workhouses where families were separated, and conditions were so horrific that many people chose to starve outside rather than enter. Public works programs that paid wages so low people working full-time still couldn't buy enough food to survive. The cruelty was systematic, intentional. A political and economic decision to let 1 million people die rather than interrupt profit or violate economic principles. Think about what it means that food was being exported from Ireland while children starved. Ships loaded with grain leaving ports where people were dying in the streets. Armed guards protecting the food from the starving population who had grown it. This wasn't a natural disaster. This was a policy decision. How do you rationalize that? How do you justify letting people die when the means to save them exists right in front of you? Most children orphaned by the famine didn't survive. With no parents, no food, no shelter, they simply died. Bridget and her 3 siblings tried to survive together for a few weeks after their parents died. They foraged for anything edible, ate grass and weeds that made them sick, wandered to the nearest town begging for food, but there were hundreds of orphaned children doing the same thing. The town couldn't support them all. Bridget watched her 10-year-old sister die on the side of a road, just collapse from weakness and never got up, too weak to even cry. She died with her eyes open, staring at the sky. Bridget couldn't bury her, didn't have the strength. She just left her sister's body by the roadside and kept walking with her 2 remaining siblings. They made it to a workhouse. The building was surrounded by desperate people trying to get in. The workhouse was already overcrowded, but they eventually admitted Bridget and her siblings. The conditions inside were nightmarish. Hundreds of people crammed into spaces designed for dozens. No sanitation. Disease everywhere. The food provided was barely enough to keep you alive. Thin gruel once a day. Bridget's younger brother died 2 weeks after entering the workhouse. Dysentery. His body was already so weakened by starvation that the infection killed him in days. Bridget was down to 1 sibling, a brother who was 9. They clung to each other, the only family either had left, but the workhouse separated them. Boys and girls were housed separately. Bridget never saw her brother again. She learned later that he died a month after separation. Typhus. He was 9 years old. Bridget was alone, the last survivor of a family of 9. She was 8 years old, had watched everyone she loved die, and was now in a system designed to be punitive rather than helpful. The workhouse operated on the principle that receiving aid should be so unpleasant that you'd do anything to avoid it. Children were worked, given minimal food, beaten for infractions. Bridget spent a year in the workhouse, a year of hunger, abuse, and watching other children die around her. The death toll in workhouses was staggering. People entered already weakened by starvation and were finished off by disease, overwork, and inadequate food. Bridget survived. She didn't know why. Why her and not her siblings? Why her and not the thousands of other children who died? There was no reason, just random chance. The difference between living and dying was often arbitrary. A slightly stronger constitution, catching a less virulent strain of disease, pure luck. Bridget left the workhouse at age 10, thin, damaged, traumatized. She eventually emigrated to America on a coffin ship, the term for the overcrowded vessels that carried Irish refugees across the Atlantic. Many died during the crossing. Bridget survived that too. She lived to adulthood, had children, never talked about the famine. What could she say? How could she explain to people who'd never known that kind of hunger what it had been like? How could she make them understand that she'd eaten grass while food was shipped past her village? That she'd watched her entire family die preventable deaths? She couldn't. So she stayed silent, buried the memories, tried to forget. The Great Famine killed 1 million people and displaced 1 million more. It destroyed families, communities, an entire way of life. And it was allowed to happen, not through ignorance, not through lack of resources, through policy decisions made by people who valued economic principles and political ideology over human lives. The famine proved that mass death can occur not from lack of food but from lack of will to distribute it. That people can starve in the midst of plenty if those with power decide their lives don't matter enough to interrupt business as usual. Bridget survived to tell the story, though she never did, but millions didn't survive. Their stories died with them. Children who starved in their parents' arms, Parents who watched their children die and couldn't save them. Entire families wiped out. Entire villages emptied, all while food existed, while help could have been given, while the means to prevent the catastrophe were available but withheld. That's the real horror of the Great Famine, not that people starved, but that they were allowed to starve. That their deaths were acceptable to the people who could have prevented them. Bridget learned that lesson at 8 years old, learned that your life only matters if you're valuable to the people in power. That starvation isn't just about lack of food, it's about who decides who gets to eat. And that lesson, paid for with 1 million Irish lives, is still relevant today, still being learned by people starving in countries with food, still proving that the greatest famines aren't natural disasters, they're human choices. And we keep making the same choice. Keep deciding that some lives matter less. Keep letting people starve while food exists. Bridget's family died in 1846. People are dying the same way today. Different countries, different circumstances, same fundamental cause. Someone decided their lives weren't worth the cost of saving them. That's the truth of famine, then and now. And until we face that truth, until we decide that no economic principle is worth human lives, the Bridgets of every era will keep losing their families. Keep learning that survival is arbitrary and help is withheld. Keep carrying the weight of being the one who lived while everyone around them died. That's the legacy of the Great Famine. And it's a legacy we're still creating every day. We let it happen again.